Good morning, Year 11. We are carrying on with our second session, exploring the question to our guided mock exam. We're looking at an inspector calls, and we are looking at this question here. To what extent does Priestley present Mrs Birling as an unlikable character? It's a 30-mark question, and we started to look at our response last week. Last session, we were reflecting on what is Sybil like at the start of the play, and we decided that Priestley shows her at the start of the play to be highly dislikable. Right from the start, it's clear that we dislike Sybil, and that is a deliberate choice made by Priestley. He presents her as a social snob, an overbearing mother, and a champion of the patriarchy. He presents her straight away to the audience as someone that we would dislike. She's cold, she's prejudiced. She represents everything that Priestley saw as being wrong with society, that overprivileged upper class who had no idea about the plight and the troubles of the working classes. So he deliberately presents her as being highly dislikable from the start. We're going to look today at Sybil in the middle of the play, but I want to step back for a moment and think about our wider essay. When we write our essay response, we are going to need to focus on where we see Sybil being dislikable at the start, in the middle, and at the end of the play. Our argument, our point, our overarching argument that we are trying to prove is that Priestley presents Mrs Birling as highly dislikable because she represents the prejudiced, privileged upper classes that as a socialist Priestley despised, and he blamed them for social inequality. And we're going to draw our evidence from the start, the middle, and the end. And for each of our sections, we're going to want a what, a how, and a why. So let's have a look today at Mrs Birling in the middle of the play. And we're going to be thinking about the what, the how, and the why in the middle of the play. We're going to think about what Priestley presents Sybil as in the middle of the play. How does she come across to us, the audience? We're going to think about how he presents her, the methods, the evidence that we can find that prove our argument that she is highly dislikable, that she's a very unlikable character. And we're going to think again about the why Priestley shows her to be unlikable at every stage of the play. And we're going to link that to his intentions and the context of 1912. So in the middle of the play, Mrs Birling is shown to be detestable. Priestley ramps up the hatred a gear. She goes from being highly dislikable to absolutely detestable. We detest her, we hate her in the middle of the play. And the reason for that is that in the middle of the play, it is revealed to us, the audience, how she treated Eva Smith, what she did to that girl that drove her to suicide. Remember, she goes to Mrs Birling's charity and she appeals for help, for charity, for love, for compassion, for support, all of those things that charities are supposed to provide. And Mrs Birling, because of her prejudice, turns the girl down. And this is the last point of support that Eva can access, and it is denied her. She is denied that support, and that is the final straw that drives her to take drastic action. It is the final link in the chain of events that bring about Eva Smith's tragic suicide. So let's have a look at Sybil in action. Let's read through this short section from the middle of the play in which Mrs Birling, faced with what she has done, reacts and gives us an insight into what she is like as a character. Inspector, as what then? Mrs Birling. First she called herself Mrs Birling. Birling astounded. Mrs Birling? Sybil. Yes, I think it was simply a piece of gross impertinence, quite deliberate, and naturally that was one of the things that prejudiced me against the case. I should think so. Damned impudence. You admit being prejudiced against her case? Yes. Mother, she's just died a horrible death. Don't forget. I'm very sorry, but I think she had only herself to blame. So just pause for a moment and think how Sybil would appear on stage at this point in time, faced with her involvement in a young girl's tragic suicide. Do we see remorse? Do we see regret? Do we see any sadness for what she's done? Absolutely not. So let's have a look at what we do see. So first of all, she talks about being prejudiced against the case. Now this is an open and blatant confession of prejudice. She confesses and she admits that she's prejudiced. And she doesn't do it shyly. She doesn't do it feeling self-conscious. She's open and blatant. There's almost a sense of pride in the prejudice that she has towards the working classes. This here, naturally, this adverb reveals that actually Sybil sees it to be perfectly normal and natural for her to be prejudiced against the working classes. She appears here to be very bigoted, to be very judgmental, very prejudiced, and it is absolutely detestable. She sees her behaviour as natural and normal to cause a young girl to take her life in so violent a way. We have this idea again, gross impertinence. I think it was a piece of gross impertinence. What an irony. In fact, this is ironic because it's Mrs Birling's behaviour that we as an audience find gross. We find her grossly cruel. We find her behaviour to be totally unnatural. This is a repetition of an earlier idea. Earlier in the play, Mrs Birling uses the word impertinent, and Sheila says, perhaps because impertinent is such a silly word. Well, we see that Mrs Birling hasn't listened. She's using that silly, ridiculous word again, and she appears silly and ridiculous to us as an audience. And lastly, perhaps the most telling piece of evidence at all. I'm very sorry, but I think she had only herself to blame. Well, firstly, it's a false apology. Clearly, she has no sorrow or remorse whatsoever for what she has done. In fact, far from taking on board any responsibility, she is blaming the girl for her death, even when Sheila has reminded her mother that Eva's death is horrible. Remember, mother, she's died a horrible death, burnt her insides out, drank strong disinfectant. And yet, even faced with that, there is no remorse. So we as an audience see her to be totally cold, really heartless and detestable. We hate her at this point in the play because she's very hateful at this point. So our answer is, in the middle of the play, Mrs Birling is shown to be detestable. Now this is an example of a student response drawing together all of those ideas that we've just looked at. The yellow is our what, the detailed blue is our how, and we have our why in grey at the end. So let's look through this together. This draws together all of the ideas that we've just seen in that very short extract showing Mrs Birling in the middle of the play. Priestley reveals Mrs Birling to be wholly detestable in the middle of the play. Priestley reveals her horrible lack of compassion to the audience through Sybil's reaction when faced with what she's done. She refuses to accept responsibility and instead insists that Eva had only herself to blame. She defends her prejudice by describing it as natural, showing her cold and unfeeling nature and intense bigotry towards the working classes. Priestley again shows Sybil to be ridiculous and unlikable through her continued use of patronising language such as impertinence, which Sheila earlier told her was silly. And as an audience, we feel disgusted by her unfeeling attitude, and we actually detest this snobbish and horrible woman and hope she gets her just desserts for treating Eva so badly. Priestley cleverly reveals Mrs Birling to be so detestable to hammer home his point that the upper classes are overprivileged and out of touch with the real world. He intends for us to see Sybil as horrible and her treatment of Eva as abhorrent, so that society has compassion and makes better choices for the millions and millions and millions of working class people still with us. So this word here is a lovely one, abhorrent. It means hateful, something that is to be hated and detested. You can see here that the writer is embedding their quotes, using the evidence, identifying the methods to prove how Mrs Birling is so unlikable, wholly detestable in the middle of the play. So, next session we will look at Sybil at the end of the play. I hope you have found today useful. Thanks, Year 11.